So I want to jump right into this conversation and begin about this issue of history. Here we are in a time when the discussion of how we tell our nation's story and live into our history is being contested and has become a source of division. Yet in your book, The Color of Law, you have said that, and I quote you, if young people are not taught an accurate account of how we come to be a segregated nation, then their generation will have little chance of doing a better job than the previous ones when it comes, indeed, to the issues of systemic, structural, if not cultural racism and anti-Blackness. The first step toward providing an accurate account of segregation is, in one sense, taking on the historical myths, such as the myth that you take on of de facto segregation. Can you speak to this mythical reality of de facto segregation and why it's essential to break that myth if indeed we're going to be a racially just nation?
Sure. We're a segregated society. I've lived in many metropolitan areas in this country. Everyone that I've lived in had clearly defined areas that are all white, all black, mostly black. Most of us think that's too bad that we live in such a segregated country. But we've adopted a rationalization, an excuse, a myth, as you called it, that excuses us from doing anything about it. Of course, I say we think it's too bad. We hope that it'll evolve away from that. We think of various policies that might or might not ameliorate it a little bit. But the myth that we have is that this all happened naturally. The reason we're segregated was just an accident of bigotry. Private homeowners or landlords wouldn't sell to African Americans in white neighborhoods, or maybe builders, bankers, real estate agents discriminated in how they carried out their purely private sector activities. People, we tell ourselves, just like to live with each other, the same race. We feel more comfortable that way. And that's why we're segregated. Or maybe it's just a question of income differences. African Americans on average, not all, but on average, have lower incomes than whites. And so many African Americans can't afford to move to higher opportunity neighborhoods. All these individual, bigoted, but private sector activities, self-choice, economic differences is what's caused our racial segregation. Like I say, we tell ourselves that what happened by accident can only unhappen by accident. This is an utter myth. Of course, there was private bigotry. Of course, there are some people who choose to live in same race neighborhoods. Of course, there are income differences. But the reason that we're such a segregated neighborhood is because of 20th century explicit federal, state, and local policies that ensured that African Americans and whites could not live near one another, and that ensured that that private bigotry would be expressed and not suppressed. That's a myth. That it happened by accident. We call this de facto segregation, something that just happened in fact, not in law or regulation or policy. My book, The Color of Law, documents the federal, state, and local policies that created this segregation, that sustained it, that reinforced it, and that enabled and really promoted that private bigotry to flourish. And let me add, the reason it's so important is because it was federal, state, and local policy. It's a constitutional violation. It's a civil rights violation. If state and local governments were doing it, it's a 14th Amendment violation. If federal government was doing it, it was a Fifth Amendment violation. If any form of government was doing it, it was a 13th Amendment violation. And when we have a civil rights violation, we have an obligation to undo it, to redress it. Simply hoping it will go away is an abandonment of our constitutional responsibilities as citizens of this country. So knowing the history is essential, because knowing the history establishes an obligation, not simply a wish that segregation is addressed. Their jobs, it was the only way they could do it. Most of the Black workers couldn't keep their jobs in this situation. This was a racially explicit policy, I say, of the Federal Housing Administration. The builders of these projects could never have assembled the capital to build large suburbs on their own. No bank would be crazy enough to lend them the money. Banks thought that these suburban developments wouldn't pencil out. They didn't think that anybody would want to move to them because we were an urban country. The only way that these developers, and they were all over the country, I don't mean to imply that just on the West Coast, the biggest one probably was in New York, east of New York City, Levittown.
Levittown, right.
Yeah, that builder could never have assembled the capital to build 17,000 homes in one place. The only way he could build it was by going to the Federal Housing Administration and Veterans Administration, submitting his plans for the development, including a commitment that they required him to make, never to sell a home to an African American. The FHA even required this builder and others to place a clause in the deed of every home prohibiting resale to African Americans or rental to African Americans. These were inexpensive homes. They sold at the time for $8,000, $9,000. In today's money, that's about $100,000. As you know, those homes in suburbs all over the country, whether it's in that suburb of Richmond, California, Milpitas, in now what's Silicon Valley, or whether it's in east of New York City or anywhere in between, hundreds and hundreds of these projects, thousands really, in metropolitan areas all over the country. The homes now sell for $300,000, $400,000, $500,000. The white families who purchased those homes for $100,000 gained over the next couple of generations, and this is what your question went to, wealth. That wealth came from the appreciation and the value of their homes. They used that equity from the appreciation to send their children to college. They use it to take care of perhaps temporary emergencies, a medical emergency, temporary unemployment. They use it to subsidize their retirements, and to get to your point, they use it to bequeath wealth to their children and grandchildren, who then had down payments for their own homes. African Americans were prohibited from participating in this wealth generating exercise. The result is that on average today, African American incomes are about 60%, 60% of white incomes. There's a whole story about that. I don't have time to go into it now, but there's a small chapter in The Color of Law that describes in part how that happened. But you would think that if African Americans have incomes that are about 60% of white incomes, family incomes on average, they'd have wealth at about 60% of white household wealth. But the reality is that while there's a 60% income ratio, there's a 5% wealth ratio. African American households have 5% of the wealth that white households have. And that enormous disparity between a 60% income ratio and a 5% wealth ratio is entirely attributable to unconstitutional federal housing policy that was practiced in the mid-20th century. And let me say, this was not the action in the FHA or VA of rogue bureaucrats who were personally bigoted. They were, of course, but this was written out in federal housing policy, dating from the New Deal, dating from the Roosevelt administration. The underwriting manual that the Federal Housing Administration and Veterans Administration distributed to appraisers all over the country, whose job it was to evaluate the applications of builders to build these single-family suburban subdivisions.